When we dehumanize others, we dehumanize ourselves. When we say those people over there are savages, they are not human, they are inferior, then we will act worse than animals when we inflict cruelty and when we impose violence on those people. A few days ago, I was reading this book by a professor, Professor Tanaka, and he wrote a book about the atrocities committed by the Japanese Imperial Army during the Second World War. And he talked about how the Japanese would dehumanize the people that they conquered. They would dehumanize POWs. They would dehumanize Chinese people. They would dehumanize Filipino people. And that's how they were able to desensitize themselves to the weight of their actions. They would butcher millions of people and think nothing of it. They destroyed an entire city named Nanking, killed hundreds of thousands of people, raped countless women, and they thought nothing of it. There was a unit in the Japanese military. It was called Unit 731, and these guys were in charge of conducting experiments on POWs and prisoners from occupied territory. They would commit experiments on Russians and on Korean people. And do you know what they would call the people that they did experiments on? They would call them logs. So they would take away the humanity of their victims. They would dehumanize them. And by dehumanizing them, they would act worse than animals, because they would believe that these people were inferior, that these people were beneath them. And so by dehumanizing them, they would act like animals, or worse than animals, I should say, themselves. You become the savage. You become worse than an animal when you dehumanize people. And monsters will find ways to justify cruelty. They will find ways to justify genocide. They will say, well, they were terrorists amongst them. Well, there were terrorists who were living amongst these people. You will find this sort of propaganda, this sort of justification being done by the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. There were indeed Armenians who were terrorists. They were Armenians. There was one incident in which Armenian nationalists took over a bank and they held the bank hostage and they started making their political demands. It didn't work. But nonetheless, yes, these were terrorists. There were indeed Armenian terrorists. There were indeed Armenians who would go out and kill people. But the Ottomans used this as a way to justify genocide. And if you talk to Turkish nationalists today, they love to talk about the actions of Armenian nationalists. And they'll say, well, look, Armenians did, such and such a bad action. Look at all these terrible things that Armenians did. Therefore, you can understand why the Ottomans were, killing Armenians. But this is the process of dehumanization. You say, well, these people have criminals amongst them. These people have terrorists amongst them. Therefore, we can slaughter entire families. We can force fathers to watch their sons die in front of them. We can rape their women. We can disembowel pregnant women. We can do all sorts of horrific things in the name of list your justifications. This is the process of dehumanization. You can find the same thing being said by Ukrainian nationalists when they talk about the slaughter of the Poles during the Second World War. The Ukrainian nationalists back in the 1940s butchered around 100,000 or so Poles in the regions of Volyn, East Galicia, etc. And if you talk to Ukrainian nationalists today, they will say, well, Poles mistreated Ukrainian people. Poles committed abuses on Ukrainian people. Polish landlords or landowners abused Ukrainian peasants. And yes, you can find incidents like those. You can find incidences such as those, but that doesn't justify you butchering entire villages. That doesn't justify you taking a woman, raping her, cutting her eyeballs out, or cutting her lips out. Yes, and the Ukrainian nationalists did these types of things, these types of horrors. When you dehumanize a people, you dehumanize yourself, because you will act like the monster that you are pretending to be fighting against. Another example. Sabra and Shatila. I recently did a video on the Sabra and Shatila massacre, which took place in September of 1982, in which Lebanese Catholic nationalists, they call themselves Maronites, entered two major refugee camps, Palestinian refugee camps, with the help of the Israeli military. They entered the camps, and for about 3 days, they butchered and raped. They murdered pregnant women, disemboweled them. They murdered children in front of their fathers. They made children fatherless. They made women husbandless. They made fathers childrenless. They butchered thousands of people in some of the most horrific bloodshed that one can ever read about. And I did a video about this, and of course, as I expected, a Maronite put a comment underneath the video, and he said those Palestinians deserved what they got. He didn't even deny it. I mean, I've seen Lebanese Maronites deny that this even happened, but this guy didn't even deny it. He just straight up said they deserve what they got. Well, how in the hell do you justify, you being a Maronite, you being a Catholic, how do you justify entering a refugee camp and raping, torturing, hacking people to death, murdering pregnant women? How in the hell do you justify this? This is what happens when you dehumanize a people. You dehumanize yourself. You become the monster. You become the savage. I remember years ago, this was back in, I want to say in 2011, I did a talk at an Anglican church in El Paso, Texas. And in this talk, I talked about the Syrian civil war, and this was during the beginning of the Syrian conflict. And I said that the rebels that NATO is supporting are murdering Christians. And this was before even ISIS popped up. And after I was done with my talk, two Lebanese gentlemen approached me, and one of them started screaming at me, started yelling at me in front of the whole audience. And he began to say, Syria is a disgusting country, it's a terrible country, and he was yelling at me. And I said, but sir, Christians are being murdered by these rebels. They're being slaughtered by these rebels. And he said, those people in Syria, they're, and he did this little hand gesture. They're, as if they're not human, as if they're insignificant. So here I saw hatred. This was hatred. And I didn't realize that Maronite Christians hated Syrian people that badly. They hate them. There is so much hatred and indifference. And I remember years later, back in 2013, I actually joined a Maronite church, not even knowing about this level of hatred. And I remember I went to this youth group meeting, and they were going to have the bishop there, Bishop Abdullah Elias. And Bishop Abdullah Elias was there. And I sat at this table by myself, and Bishop Abdullah Elias approaches my table and sits at the same table. And then 3 other priests came and sat at the same table as mine. And one of the priests asked me, and they're all Lebanese, and one of the priests asked me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Oh, I'm from California." And he said, "No, where are you really from?" I'm thinking, this is so insane. Like, what type of a church what type of a church is this where a priest asks a random congregant about their ethnicity? Like, this was crazy to me. But I told them I'm Palestinian. And the energy in the room just changed when I said that. They don't like Palestinians. They just don't like them. And I, of course, brought up the Syrian conflict. And I said, well, Christians are being killed in Syria. And one of the priests said, all that is just politics. And it's basically telling me that it was insignificant. I don't remember every word he told me. But you could just feel the hatred. And last year, the patriarch, the official patriarch of the Maronite Church, Bichara Butros El-Rai, stated that Syrian refugees living in Lebanon should be forced to leave. And the rhetoric coming out of the patriarch is just as vicious as a lot of the nationalists in Lebanon. Just as vicious as the type of rhetoric that's coming out of other nationalists in Lebanon is what I mean. And I saw a video today, came out, I want to say on July 28th, late July, so very recently. There was a video that came out from this neighborhood in Lebanon. I think it's called Burj Hamoud, or Hamoud. And in this video, you can see a gang of Lebanese nationalists brutally beating up a Syrian refugee. And it would not surprise me that in the future, if the situation, if the crisis in Lebanon gets so bad, that Lebanese nationalists will rise up and try to kill every Syrian that they see. It wouldn't surprise me at all if this were to happen in the future, because it happened against the Palestinians. And all it takes is dehumanization. All that is required for men to act unhuman is for them to dehumanize others. Because when we dehumanize others, we actually dehumanize ourselves. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.